issues in cognitive science. Our first talk is going to be by Ben Young, who teaches philosophy and some neuroscience at University of Nevada, Reno. Ben works mostly on smell. He and I actually just signed a contract to put together an edited textbook on mind, cognition, and neuroscience, a philosophical introduction, I think is our current title, so it'll be like a CogSci textbook. We just signed with Rutledge to do that, so we'll be working on learning everything about cognitive science in the next couple of years. Yeah, so it's really great to have Ben here. If you're a student, make sure you sign in. You can always do it at the end. Yeah, welcome.
So thank you for having me. I know I'm the first talk of the semester, and I don't know about you, but I like to ease myself into the semester, so I'm going to set your expectations really low for the speaker series, and then allow all the other speakers to exceed your expectations. So here's what I want you to do while we're getting started. Take a jelly bean, okay? Don't eat the jelly bean yet. There should be more than one for each person, but I don't know. I just grabbed a box, an entire bag of them, and kind of scooped it in and then paid and went, oh my gosh, I can't believe jelly beans cost that much. These are kosher for those people that are worried about such things, or halal, so don't worry about that. But hold on to the jelly bean, we're going to use it. We're going to do something rather interesting. So Carolyn asked me to give a talk on theories of mind, and I'm supposed to be a philosopher of mind, but I work primarily on perception nowadays and in neuroscience, so I had to rack my brain and think, like, what do I know about philosophy of mind that I can actually lecture about for 45 minutes in an accessible format? So we're going to talk about compositionality. First we're going to go through what compositionality is, or at least two precursors of compositionality. Then we'll talk about one way that you can start thinking about compositionality in connection to thought. And from there, move on to current work that I'm doing in philosophy of perception on compositionality within perception. So it should be about three parts, right? Compositionality, thought, and then perception. And it should, and for the most part, be transparent where we are when we are. Okay, once everyone gets a jelly bean, doesn't matter what color it is. I know some people like to think, don't eat it yet. Hold on to it. We're going to talk about one form of compositionality which people in philosophy of perception don't talk about all that often, and it's going to be kind of interesting because you're going to learn something about smell at the same time, and since I work on smell, it's nice to talk about smell at the outset. There's something like 1,000 people in the entire world that work on smell, so given that I'm assuming no one here knows about this will be fun for a second. And of course this is something that I stole from someone else who stole from someone else, so the jelly bean example is originally due to Stuart Firestone, who is a great leader in olfaction, and then of course Barry Smith stole it from him, and then I stole it from Barry Smith. So if anyone asks you who came up with this great experiment, it's me, but it works for the most part. Now another thing that I was thinking about is that I've been working on this topic for close to 2 decades by now. One of the nice things about being around for a long period of time is after a while you get to work on the same topic over and over again from a lot of different ways, and I was noticing that a lot of the different theories that I've worked on over the years all range over compositionality. And there's something about the assumption that they make about compositionality that runs throughout them, that traces all the way back to Gottlieb Frege. And we're going to get to that, and then once we get through that, then I'm going to show you how the whole notion of compositionality and the different kinds of compositionality explains a host of different debates throughout philosophy and throughout, to some extent, neuroscience when it comes to olfaction. Okay, everyone has a jelly bean? Oh. Who still doesn't have jelly bean? Okay, here's what I want you to do. It's going to sound really funny, okay? I want you to take your other hand and hold your nose like this. Don't speak, it sounds funny. Stick the jelly bean in. Chew the jelly bean. Chew it, chew it, chew it. Close your lips, open your nose. When you're chewing it, all you have is the flavor, the taste, gustation. You open your nose, and then you can taste it. But isn't that weird? Where's the taste? So the taste is not on your tongue, right? The taste that you're getting on the tongue was really uninteresting, right? The tongue on its own, just gustation on its own, gives you that sweet flavor. And nothing more. If you want, there's more jelly beans. You can keep on playing this as I'm talking. That's more fun than what I'm going to be doing, right? What you, in the end, say is taste is actually something called flavor. And flavor, for the most part, is retronasal olfaction. It's the olfaction that comes up from the back of your throat. You have 2 different roads for olfaction, for smell. One is orthonasal from the front of the nose, and one is retronasal from the back of your throat. Almost everything that we call flavor is smell. Right? And the wonder that we then have is, well look, we have these two different systems going on. We have gustation and we have olfaction, and they're both working together to generate something new called flavor. Right? And so some things that you might worry about in terms of composition is how do different sensory modalities work together to generate experiences? And it becomes a real big issue when you start worrying about unimodal versus cross-modal olfaction or perception in general. How is it that while you're sitting in your seat, you have an experience of the room, of the visual and auditory things that are happening in the room, but at the same time you're aware of your bodily experiences? And so we have to have some story about composition, how the different parts of the experience compose the overall Gestalt phenomenon. Now, what I really want to be talking about today, though, is primarily going to be visual phenomenology and to some extent olfaction. So here's an example that I like to use all the time. Does anyone know what this is an image of?
It's a sand dunes, and it's not edited.
Yeah, so it's sand dunes, right? But what's happening in the image? Now, when I teach this, or when I cover this image, and I'm somewhere like Israel or Nevada, then people instantly get it. Right? If you're in the Pacific Northwest, or you're in the Northeast, then people look at it and go, oh, maybe it's like snow? Maybe it's some sort of alien image from some sort of edited National Geographic thing? But this is a real live image, nothing's been doctored whatsoever. It's not of some sort of other weird planet, it's this planet. Okay, so what time of day do you think this is?
Dawn?
Yeah, it's sunrise, right? And what you're seeing is the sun rising on the sand dunes, lighting up the sagebrush in the background against the backdrop of the shadows on the trees. Okay. Now, once I give you that explanation of the scene, can you see it differently? No. I mean, now you're stuck, right? Now you see it as sand dunes with sagebrush at dawn in Africa. And now it's stuck in your head from that conceptual perspective as seeing it the same way. Can anyone go back and see it as having snowflakes now? Snowfall in some sort of weird part of Siberia on a desert landscape? Really hard, right? So there's this point in time before you conceptualize it as a certain way that you see it without any concepts and you're not sure what it is. Are you seeing it? Yeah. Is there a perception of the experience? Yeah. But is it conceptualized as what the thing is with some sort of referential value? Not at all. So one thing that we're going to want to talk about today is what's the difference between perception and thought that is fully conceptualized, whereby you understand what the image is of and the referential value, and what's the difference of perceptual states before they've been fully conceptualized, or what are non-conceptual states? And I think it all turns around this notion of compositionality. Okay, so compositionality is actually a thing that goes back to Frege. And until Frege mentions it, then most people don't think about it, and it's so trivial that it's ubiquitous and everyone just assumes it. And compositionality, or at least Frege's principle, is the claim that the meaning of a sentence is derived from the meaning of its component parts and their mode of combination. Sounds trivial, right? The meaning of your thoughts are a matter of the primitive elements of them and how those are combined. And everyone just assumes, oh, that makes sense, right? The complex thoughts are just a matter of the meaning of the components. And then no one really focuses on that last bit, the mode of combination. Okay, so one thing I'm going to be arguing for today is compositionality, or composition in general, is a system-relative property. Depending upon the system of representations that you have will depend upon the different modes of combination, and those different modes of combinations will generate different modes of compositionality, and that's going to be differences that we'll have between thoughts and perceptions, and perhaps even perceptual systems. And these differences of overall representational modes of combination can explain a host of different cognitive phenomena. Another time that we see compositionality is in Gareth Evans' generality constraint. Evans' generality constraint is the claim that if anyone can understand that a given object has a property, then they can understand that that same object could have an infinite number of different properties. So here's a simple one. If you can understand that cats are fluffy, you can also understand that cats are four-legged, that they have fur, that they enjoy being petted, for an infinite number of concepts that you have. Now, both claims of compositionality already assume that there's an overarching structure, either to sentences in language, which is what the Frege's principle is supposed to be. Sentences in language have a complex meaning-like structure. But Evans' claim is something more about thinking. Anyone that can think the thought that a certain object has a certain property should be able to think the same thought but exchange the properties for whatever properties they have. So if you can think that this circle is red, you could also think that the circle is purple or green for an infinite number of color concepts that you'll have. Now, the reason why it's interesting to focus upon both of these is because one is a claim about linguistic compositionality, and the other one is a claim about overall cognitive compositionality. And the one is going to be, do the two come apart? And for the most part, they don't come apart within the literature, because the one place that we start seeing the notion of compositionality in regard to thought is when we start talking about the language of thought hypothesis. Now, the language of thought hypothesis is originally put forward by Jerry Fodor, and the claim is supposed to be that if we want to begin to understand what thinking is, we can do it in a three-part fashion. The first claim is that we can begin to regiment our overall theory of the mind in terms of propositional attitude descriptions. So when I want to explain your behavior, what I can do is I can look at your behavior and then try to, in the end, infer what kinds of beliefs and desires did you have to have before you did the thing. And then once I have that down, I can begin to try to figure out what was the underlying structure of those thoughts. Now, it's quite odd that he calls them propositional attitude descriptions, because what he really means is propositions. When you have the thought that Coke is the thirst quencher, the claim is going to be that you have this odd concept where you have the object Coke, and then you have some sort of property, being the thirst quencher. And that's going to have this logical structure. And that's going to be the first step that he has in the language of thought hypothesis, that we can begin to ascribe thoughts to you in terms of having these logical structures. Once we ascribe thoughts to you in terms of having logical structures, though, we can begin to, in the end, try to figure out what the computational basis of that structure would be. And so what we're going to try to then do is try to figure out how do we move from what would be thought to the underlying syntactic language of thought. And once we have that out of the way, we're supposed to try to figure out whatever the physical implementation is. And Fodor in classic philosopher style goes, we don't care about implementation. That's just wetware stuff. What we care about is the syntax of thought. Now, one of the strong arguments that he has for the language of thought hypothesis is that in order to learn a language, you already have to have a language. You know, let's be very careful here, though. When we start talking about the language of thought, the claim is not that you talk to yourself in English in your head. And the claim is not that if we had different languages, we'd have different languages in our head, different natural languages. The claim is that simply thought has a linguistic-like structure. And the wonder is going to be, what is the linguistic structure, or why worry about this at all? And the reason why you might worry about this is because it's quite clear that when we have thoughts, thoughts have intentionality. Thoughts are about things outside of our heads. And if thoughts have intentionality, if they're about things outside of our head, then we might have something called the representational theory of thought, that our thoughts have representations about things outside of us. And then if thoughts have this representational value, then we might have to come up with a further claim called the representational theory of thinking, that when I think, all I'm doing is I'm manipulating symbols. I'm manipulating the symbols in such a way that I begin to generate complex representations. Okay, now I know it's supposed to be easy talk to easier in the semester, so let's break this down a little bit more so it's easier. So the claim is going to be that we can infer the representational structure of the content from our perceptual and cognitive abilities. And now often these are called inferences to the best explanation, right, but that's a fancy term, so here's the thought. I specify some sort of weird phenomenon, okay, and I say, here's the phenomenon. We all agree we can do this. And you go, yeah. And then I go, and I have the best explanation. And you go, no. Or something along those lines. So let's start with a simple one, cognitive productivity. Okay, you can think an infinite number of new and novel thoughts. Okay, here's a simple one. Think about angelic winged donkeys. Everyone can do that? Think about angelic winged donkeys with pink polka dots. Think about green angelic winged donkeys with pink wings and purple polka dots. Everyone still with me? We can keep on going all day, right? I can just keep on adding, right? Colors, right? Think about angelic winged pink polka dotted donkeys with giant ram's horns, the ones that Satan has, right? We can just keep on going ad infinitum, is the claim, right? We can think an infinite amount of new and novel thoughts. Well, how do we explain this phenomenon? Any thoughts? mean, before I came here, did you think about angelic winged donkeys with ram's horns? Probably not, right? I mean, I do all the time because I'm like, let's play this game. Right, now, it's a very interesting claim because the claim is going to be we can think an infinite number. Can we think an infinite number of new and novel thoughts? No, right? You're going to die eventually, right? So you could imagine getting a research assistant saying, to NSF, so my job is going to be, I'm going to have a research assistant. They're going to think an infinite number of new and novel thoughts and write them down so we don't repeat ourselves, right? And you can imagine the reviewer number 3 is going to be like, but your research assistant's going to die before they finish. You're like, oh crap, right? So we'll just have an infinite number of research assistants. And then you go, wait, it can't be an infinite number of research assistants. It has to be thinkable by one person. So what exactly do we mean? Well, the argument is supposed to be the way that we can in the end explain this is in the same way that language is productive. We know that language is productive because it has an iterative grammar to it. And the claim is going to be that we can explain cognitive productivity in the same way that we explain linguistic productivity. Linguistic productivity has subject-predicate structures such that we can manipulate the number of predicates that we have in some sort of infinite fashion. So we can show that language has a recursive function, and if language has this recursive structure with subject-predicates, then we must have the same kind of structure in cognition. Right? But that's moving from language to thought. Right? So if we assume that we think in a linguistic medium, then this works. So a lot of people didn't buy this argument. And a lot of people said that Fodor was cooking the books because he's assuming linguistic productivity to show that thought must be linguistic. Well, what about systematicity? Well, maybe we could say, we don't want to say that thought is productive, we just want to say that it is systematic. Okay? So anyone who can understand the sentence that Sally loves Bess can understand the sentence that Bess loves Sally. Did anyone have a problem? How do we explain this phenomenon? Well, we explain it because in language, we can understand that we have relational terms with two predicates, where we have A bearing some representation to B, and then we can flip the objects and just have B bear some representation to A. So we can once again explain the cognitive phenomena in terms of the linguistic phenomena. So let's explain linguistic systematicity in terms of, well, linguistics. But then again, this is cooking the books. We're assuming language. And if language is a certain way, then thought must be as well. And then the claim is going to be that language must always be this way, and therefore thought must always be this way. But once again, people have said, but you're extrapolating from language, Fodor. So maybe we can then talk about cognitive systematicity. So instead of talking about sentences, let's say the phenomena is anyone who can understand that Sally loves Bess can understand that Bess loves Sally. Everyone can do this? Anyone who can understand that Jerry Fodor loves brown cow can understand that brown cow loves Jerry Fodor. Or can you? I mean, if I say Jerry Fodor loves brown cow, but does brown cow really love Jerry Fodor? I suggest you don't do this. I was told by the admissions officer from Rutgers that making bestiality jokes about Jerry Fodor in your writing sample is a bad idea. But you can give pause, right? I mean, when you do, you kind of go, I understand that love is a one-way relationship, and it's unclear if bovine creatures can love Jerry back in the same kind of way, right? So but when we do that, we begin to show that language and thought seem to have some sort of structure in between them. And the way we explain this is that it must be that thought has some sort of underlying systematic structure, whereby the parts of it can be manipulated in certain ways to generate complexes. And the wonder is going to be, well, what kind of structure we need? Now, we see this also when we start talking about visual and auditory systematicity. Okay? Now, you can easily imagine that you have different circles in different orientations, and then you can understand the visual symbols as changing their orientations. Same thing with auditory systematicity. Some of my favorite pieces of music are the ones where they end in the middle of a chord. And then what happens in your head? You have auditory completion, right? It finishes midway through the chord, and then in your mind you complete it for yourself. Or if you don't complete it, there's a sense of dissatisfaction with the music. Right? Brahms is famous for this. At some big concertos, at the end they'll just finish, and they're midway through, and you watch the audience go, like, what? You can't finish there. Let us finish it, right? And then most people do in their heads. So you also have auditory systematicity, where if you can hear a set of chords going up, you can hear the same set of chords going down. There's a certain structure to it. You also get this when you talk about perceptual object tracking, right? You can, in the end, track objects and their locations and their properties. So some people were thinking this wasn't fair that Fodor was using all these examples from language. What about other modalities, such as vision and audition? And then along come Horgan and Tiensen and say, well, what about sports? And everyone's like, yes, we love the pickers. And they thought, well, wait a second. Think about what professional sports players have to do. They have to track people, placements on pitch, overall statistics of regularities, and where the person's going to be in the next few seconds. That requires some sort of structure where you're tracking both objects and properties. And how do we go about doing that? So it's quite clear that thought, or cognitive abilities in general, have to have an underlying structure to explain our ability. And of course, we can also talk about deductive logic, but let's not do that because that's boring. So here's the thing I want to stress. Since what we're trying to do is infer the structure of thought from a given cognitive capacity, the target phenomena matters a great deal. If we start off with language as our target phenomena, then thought's going to look a lot like language. If the only tool that you have is a hammer, then everything looks a lot like a nail. Right? If you start with other modalities and you infer from the other modalities, then the kind of structure that you end up with for thought is going to vary drastically. Right? So the language of thought hypothesis gets off the ground because we use linguistic examples of systematicity of productivity. Right? Even the visual system, one of the interesting things of the visual system is it's going to have a very similar structure. Right? Notice how nicely those circles line up. And notice that all of you say a target. Right? The moment I say target, you're like, whoa, just colors and circles. Right? I mean, no one here just goes, I can't see a target, I just see circles arranged in some sort of symmetric fashion. Right? You see these things in a certain way, and the wonder is going to be how? Well, it depends upon something called compositionality. Right? We're finally getting to the topic of the talk. Okay? Now, compositionality is actually nothing big. It's actually a very simple idea, but we all kind of drum it up as something more. In order to have a compositional system, all you need to have is specifications of primitives, some rules of formation and decomposition. How is it that you can take the primitives, form them into complexes? How is it that you can take the complexes, decompose them into other complexes? And rules of well-formedness. That's all you need to have a compositional system. Now, if that's all you need to have a compositional system, the wonder is why we always think that compositional systems look like language. And it's because by default, we usually think about logic as our starting point. What a lot of people don't realize is that in the history of philosophy, if you start with Frege was a mathematician who develops a logical system. If you start using a logical system to think about thought, and that's your generation for your launchpad for theorizing, then thought's going to look a lot like logic. And if that's going to be the case, then the composition that you assume of thought is going to be concatenative compositionality. Okay, concatenative compositionality is a claim that the complex representation must preserve tokens of an expression's constituents and their sequential relations in the expression. Okay, that's a mouthful, right, for mid-afternoon. Should we break it down to something simple? Okay, so we need to have primitives, modes of combination, and well-formedness. And it all has to be a matter of concatenation. Concatenative just means juxtaposition in space and time. Okay, so here are the primitives. Everyone sees the primitives. Everyone understands the primitives. Here's our complex. Everyone sees the complex? Anyone not see the face? Okay. Notice that the face, right, the complex semantic value of that visual image is determined based upon the constituent structure. It's the juxtaposition of the crayons in space. You move a few of those crayons around, and you don't have a face anymore. Right? I mean, if you have a blob of dark colors here, then it disrupts the overall facial structure. Right? The complex meaning is nothing more than the spatio-temporal juxtaposition of the elements together. Now, one reason that this is kind of cool to work with is because it's a nice visual example of concatenative compositionality. Right? The complex meaning is determined from the concatenation. Another way that we could represent this, of course, would be using classic logic, A and B. Right? What's the meaning of A and B? Well, it's A and B together, right? And to have a full concatenative system, we also have to have the brackets. On a concatenative understanding of compositionality, the literal tokening, the literal expression of the components is required within the complex. If you don't have the constituent structure in the right kind of way, you don't have a complex value. But then you might wonder, what about these other computational models? I mean, so up until now, if we have a classical computational model, that's perfectly fine. Classical computational models of the kind that the language of thought hypothesis assumes, or classical computational models assumes something like logic, concatenation. But what if it turns out to be that you think that your overall architecture can't do that? What if you have a connectionist architecture? So one of the debates that pops up in the mid-70s, 80s, is what if we have something that actually cares about physical implementation, right? Going back to the language of thought hypothesis, we have the propositional calculus, we have some sort of computational device, and then Fodor goes, we don't care about physical implementation. And a lot of people come and say, wait, but brains don't look like computers, right? What if we built something that actually cares about the physical implementation, right? What if we care about the system and we want to make something that doesn't look like it has the classical device, but rather has distributed representations? So when I say connectionist networks, I'm not talking about localist networks where each node has a given semantic value. What's of interest for connectionist networks is when we have distributed networks whereby the complex semantic value is housed across all of the nodes within the network. Am I safe in assuming that everyone here knows what a connectionist network is? That's the hardest thing to explain to an audience sometimes. Right? So if we have a distributed network, then how is it that they can do something like systematicity or productivity? Right? If we have distributed representations, how do they represent A and B and A? It's unclear. It's one of the things that then comes out of this debate. And so here's a different idea. Maybe if we have a connectionist architecture, then we can begin to care about physical implementation, but in addition to caring about physical implementation, we can also care about something that I like to call secondary processing concerns. If we're trying to, in the end, generate something like hard AI that can give us an insight into thinking, we want the system to not only be able to perform the function of systematicity or productivity, but we also want to do it in a way that mimics human thought, right? In a way that we have time constraints, right, and fatigue effects. And connectionist architectures cared about that. Or even better, if we start in the end thinking about something like systematicity, and I make a joke about bestiality and Jerry Fodor, I want you to laugh. It should be humorous. Now on a classical device, it's not humorous, because it turns out to be, I just represent A and B and A, right? On a connectionist network, the association should be there, right? So it turns out to be that there should be some sort of associations. Or going back to Evan's generality constraint, I should be able to, in the end, couple every single concept I have to every single object, but there should be ones that seem weird, right? So I can say the moon is circular. The moon is large. The moon is an astronomical body. The moon is true. You go, wait, yes, true is a predicate in my language, but that doesn't sit right. Now, on a classical device, that should be fine, right? But we want to capture the associations of the word true as well, and something about the grammatical use of true. And a connectionist network with the association should be able to capture these secondary processing. But how does it do it, is the question that a lot of people ask. Well, there was this idea that Van Gelder came forward with. And Van Gelder thought that maybe we could talk about, instead of concatenated compositionality, functional compositionality. And functional compositionality requires a general, effective, and reliable process for producing expression given its constituents and decomposing the expression back into those constituents. Okay, so it's a function. Now, once again, let's play the game so that you don't have to think too hard. Hey, where am I? Primitives. Everyone sees the primitives. Complex. Everyone sees the complex value here? It's harder. It's there. Once I tell it to you, like, oh, I see it. It's a bouquet. I mean, everyone sees the bouquet, right? Is it generated the same way? Well, does it have constituent structure? And we could have a whole debate about art theory and how to interpret these, and the fact that there's a bunch of oval circles to some extent, and they're really like circles, but they're colors, and they're oval. The constituent structure is not about the juxtaposition of the exact same shapes in time and space, right? The constituent structure doesn't seem to be the same. So we can imagine a system that takes primitives and generates a complex from those primitives, but doesn't necessarily have to represent the individual elements within the complex, right? And it would still have complex meaning. Now, we could of course use a lot of these, but here's a simpler way of thinking about it. If you think about classical logic, right, when we want to say that there's a proposition, we say P. Right? When we want to say that the proposition is not true, we put some sort of negation sign next to it, depending upon your system. Right? Where we say it's not the case that P. Right? This is classic concatenative compositionality. What if we didn't want to do that? What if instead we just flip it? When we say P, we say P. When we say not P, we just say upside down P. Right? That would have complex semantic value of not P, but no complex syntactic entity. Right? Unless, of course, we're treating three-dimensional entities as something that's complex, but let's imagine that we're not doing that. Right? In the same way that if you said, but if we're not using base 10, then 2 plus 2, right? Don't bug me. Right? So, but we could do that. Or we could have lots of words where it turns out to be that the complex meaning is not a matter of the exact syntactic entity, but about how do we know the words fit together. Right? Nothing means not a thing. So when you say, hey, there's nothing in there, no one goes into the room looking for nothing. We all understand that means there's not a thing in there, right? And we have these words that have complex semantic value, even though they don't have complex syntax. Okay, now on this story, right, what we have to do is we take something like the primitives, and from those primitives we form a complex, and then we can decompose it back into those complex. Should we do it again? So we start with circles. Right? Or if we want to do systematicity, right, we can take those circles, we can form them into a complex, and then we can decompose them into the same primitives again. Now, according to Van Gelder's notion of functional compositionality, it's very important that the system be able to take the elements, form the complex, and decompose them back into the elements so that it can then reform the new complex. You have to be able to think that Sally loves Bess. Right? Take Sally, takes loves, takes Bess, put them together, decompose them back into Sally, loves, and Bess, and then recompose them into Bess, loves, Sally. And so it was very important for Van Gelder's understanding of functional compositionality to show that the system could both compose, decompose, and recompose. Okay, what I want to argue, though, is that it turns out to be that lots of perceptual systems don't need to satisfy all conditions. There might be different forms of functional compositionality, whereby the system can take primitives and form them into complex, but in the case of olfaction, it can't decompose those complexes. We have complex semantic entities, or complex content in olfaction that is non-decomposable. So to go back, there might be 3 different kinds of compositionality. There might be concatenative compositionality, there might be functional compositionality, and then there might be another form of compositionality we'll find in perception that doesn't in the end perform a decomposition, or cannot perform a decomposition. Okay, now you might be wondering, why bother with all this technical garbage? It's really boring. It is. But it turns out to be that it has huge ramifications. It has huge ramifications for how we begin to think about concepts. Remember that a compositional system has to have primitives. What are the primitives in the system? Well, they're concepts. What are concepts? Well, concepts are minimally mental particulars. Anyone know what a mental particular is? This is philosopher talk. The smallest possible thing that can be part of a thought. That's simple enough, right? No, not at all. Everyone can understand fish. Everyone has a concept fish. Yeah? Can we combine that concept of fish with other concepts? Fish are pets. Fish live in water, right? Fish are not mammals. Right? So we can do all sorts of things with our individual components of thoughts. They're mental particulars. And concepts are compositional. They're supposed to compose larger thoughts. Okay, so one of the outcomes of all of this is that if we're going to start saying that thought is compositional in any sense, and it turns out to be that the minimal primitives of the system are going to be concepts, then we're going to have some sort of issues when we start trying to figure out how is it that thought interacts with perception. Okay, so the way that this now boils out is when we start thinking about something like the modularity of mind hypothesis, we can begin to understand why Fodor says what he does when we start talking about modularity. It turns out to be that if the executive unit is using the language of thought, then how is it that the executive unit, using the language of thought, interacts with perceptual systems that don't use the language of thought? Okay, so go back to the second slide. Remember that image? You saw the image at one stage, right? Before you conceptualized it, right? Before you conceptualized it, you saw this beautiful thing. And you could see it, and you're having a visual experience, right? But the moment I started introducing all these concepts to you, the experience shifted. How did that go on? Well, there was a point at which your concepts couldn't be applied to that perception, whereby you had a modular visual experience that wasn't conceptualized. Okay? And then all of a sudden, as concepts come along, you can begin to conceptualize it. But if it turns out to be that there's going to be a difference between perception and concepts, the one is going to be what explains that. Well, the executive unit uses concepts. Concepts are classically compositional or concatenative. But your modular systems are information encapsulated, They have a proprietary database and proprietary format. At least that's what Fodor claims. And his arguments for that is, well, we don't have cognitive penetration, which is such a horrible term. There's no cognitive influence, right? Your concepts don't influence what you perceive, right? What's the classical example? The Muller-Lyer experience, right? Now, after you've seen it the first time in an integral psych class, is anyone tricked? Sometimes, right? I mean, after my first experience, I'm like, the lines are the same, leave me alone, right? But that might be the New Yorker cynic in me, where it's like, stop trying to trick me, right? And then you do the shadows, but the shadows work, right? When we have the shadow experiences and you move the same shade from different shading, and then you see it as gray, you see it as white, and then you go, holy crap, I know it's the same color, but I can't see it as the same. Why? Well, in photo store, it's because you have these different modules. The modules use different formats. If the modules use different formats, what is the difference of format? Well, one of the formats is going to be concatenative, and the other format's going to be what? Fodor never says. In fact, what he says is it's non-conceptual. Okay, so one of the reasons why I'm focusing on compositionality is because compositionality is going to explain on a lot of classical systems the difference between conceptual states and what we call non-conceptual content, whereby the executive unit and thinking and cognition and language are all going to be concatenative, and our perceptual systems are going to use a different format. It's going to be not concatenative. It's like not butter. We can't tell you what it is, but it's not concatenative. And then since it's not concatenative, this is supposed to explain the difference between perception and cognition. Now, remember the target? Did anyone see this instead? It's the same thing, right? I mean, after all, the target's just a layer cake from the top. Now that I tell you that the target's just a layer cake from the top, does that change your perception of it? I don't think so. I mean, next time you see the target, you're just going to see the target. But I say, hey, guys, look, it's a target. No. Just joking. It's a layer cake from the top. You're like, no, Ben, it's a target. Right? That's a layer cake. Now, the whole purpose of focusing on this is it turns out that by shifting our perspective on what the format's going to be, we'll shift what we're talking about. The target phenomena, what we start with as the phenomena that we're trying to explain, is going to shift the kind of compositionality that we're after. And it turns out to be that before I've argued that we can begin to explain the difference in conceptual thought and non-conceptual thought in terms of the overall compositionality at play. So I have this paper that argues that the difference between conceptual thought and non-conceptual thought is just a matter of functional compositionality versus concatenative compositionality. But I realized recently that can't be completely right. What if we're not classicists? Or what if we don't accept the language of thought hypothesis? What if we're associatives? Or what if we, in the end, think that connectionist architecture is the way to go, and this classical computational stuff is a bunch of garbage? What do we do then? Because if it turns out to be that connectionism is right, or associative networks are right, or that functional semantics are right, then everything is going to be functional compositionality. So then how do we differentiate between conceptual thoughts, which have these associations involved in them, and non-conceptual thoughts? Well, maybe it's in terms of the non-decomposition. So what I would like to offer you as I conclude is our argument that olfaction employs a combinatorial system of representations that is not concatenative. But I'm going to take it one step further. Not only is it not concatenative, it's not even functionally compositional. It's going to be functionally compositional but not decompositional. And what's going to be rather interesting about this is that we can begin to explain interface condition issues between different modules, or between different abilities, based upon compositional formats. Okay, so what I'm going to end up by arguing is that we have this horrible deficit in naming smells. And we can explain that because our concepts use something like functional compositionality or concatenative compositionality, and olfaction employs a different non-decompositional format. So, of course, this is going to require some empirical work. Okay, so let's start with talking about smell now. So transitioning out of thought and out of perception to smell completely. What's a smell? Philosophers don't really know, scientists don't really know. So I'll offer you the molecular structure theory, which is arguably true, which means that I argue for it and therefore it's true. Okay, so the molecular structure theory is that what we smell is the molecular structure of chemical compounds with odor plumes. It's a big thing. Okay, so what we smell are the tiny little chemical structures within the gaseous cloud as it hits our nostrils. Why is that interesting? Well, if it turns out to be that what we're actually smelling are chemical objects don't behave like visual objects. Okay? The nice thing about visual objects is they're concatenated, right? When you think about the target, right, or the layer cake, there's nice components that are arranged in a nice visual syntactic format. Chemicals, when combined together, sometimes have synergistic effects, whereby it turns out to be that they have new additive properties that they wouldn't have on their own. So you're going to need a system that behaves a little bit differently if it's going to, in the end, be able to transduce the target phenomenon. So it turns out to be that olfaction actually has such a system. Okay, so let's start with the olfactory bulb. Right, so let's do the layer cake game. Right? Start with the smallest possible component of the olfactory system and work all the way up to cognition to show that it has non-decomposable formats. Okay, now at the olfactory bulb, we don't have a line-line system that we have in vision, meaning that we don't have sensory neurons that are individually sensitive to one kind of stimulus. They are promiscuous at best. We don't know exactly what's going on at the olfactory bulb, to be quite honest, so we don't really know what the receptor neurons are doing. But what we do know is that they have an affinity to every kind of structure. They just fire differently depending upon what kind of structure they transduce. Right? And it's not that one neuron is actually in the end transducing one kind of structure, because the chemical target phenomenon is a lot bigger than the neurons. So the best way of conceiving of what's going on at the receptor level is that you have a whole bunch of receptors touching a structure, and they're all sending in feedback about what it is, like many blind men touching an elephant and trying to figure out what it is that they're touching. We don't have concatenative syntax at the olfactory bulb, at the receptor level. We also don't have it at the olfactory bulb. Right, so if you start in the end saying, well, it's not going to be receptor line-line systems like you might have in vision, but maybe that's something like the ganglion or the cochlea and other perceptual modalities. Well, it turns out to be we don't have a chemotopic map at the olfactory bulb. For those of you that don't know where that is, the olfactory bulb is right about here if you were to drill a hole straight in behind your eyes. Right? And it turns out to be that what we have is a very rough chemotopic map. It's not that the olfactory bulb in the end has information, it's that each one of the ganglia, which collect neurons from each one of the receptor neurons, has some sort of affinity to different ones. So if we have to read off what an individual stimulus is, the best way of thinking about it is each olfactory bulb neuron or each ganglion fires differently depending upon what it is. And if you could read off the firing pattern of the entire bulb at once, you'd have a decent idea of what you're transducing. In the same way that a barcode scanner, right, scans the entire barcode, but each one of the individual lines on their own has no semantic value on its own. Right? So this is going to be functionally compositional, certainly not concatenated in any sense. Okay? Now, you might go, but that's all sensory, right? That doesn't matter for actual experiences, because no one experiences their bulb, right? No one here is going, wait, I know what my bulb is doing right now. So maybe we have to kick it up a notch, right? Moving up the layer cake. So what if we start talking about cortical encoding? Well, the piriform cortex, where most of sensory neurons are going to be transduced from the bulb to the piriform cortex, then at the piriform cortex, we don't have individual neurons being sensitive to any chemical structures. What we have instead is that groups of neurons seem to have associations with groups of chemicals put together. So one of my favorite studies is they trained rats, of course not humans, because we can't do this kind of experiments on humans, but they trained rats on a 10-odorant mixture. And it turns out to be that there was a group of neurons that seemed to have been sensitive to the 10-odorants. They then removed 2 of the components from the mixture. Those neurons still responded the same. They thought, oh, that's pretty weird. So they decided to give the rat a new set of 10 odorants, and that system was not sensitive at all. So it turns out to be that that group of neurons has some sort of associative coding for overall mixtures. It doesn't matter whether or not you have all the components or not, it still treats it as the same. And you might go, well, that's still sensory stuff, it's still cortex, you have no meaning or experience, so let's kick it up one more notch. Let's talk about, oh, it's the same slide again, let's talk about mixtures. So olfactory mixtures are the primary thing that we smell all the time. You never probably smell an individual monomolecular structure because you're probably not a chemist, right, or a perfume chemist. What you usually smell are groups of chemicals together. Now it turns out to be that when you begin to combine chemicals together, they have this weird effect. Right? Sometimes when you combine them together, you get configural mixtures. Okay, so if I take lemon and I take lime and I combine it together, what kind of a smell do you think you get? 7-Up, Sprite. What does it smell like? It's lemon limey. Well, is it lemon or is it lime? No, it's lemon limey, right? And of course, the marketing executives at Coca-Cola realize this, right? You take 2 simple components, you put them together, and you get this new smell. right? And the consumer's like, whoa, man, new smell, just two things, right? Configural mixtures. But sometimes you take two smells and you put them together, and you don't get a configural, you get a clear elemental. So let's play this game again. Strawberries and gasoline. What do you think it smells like?
Gasoline.
Strawberries and gasoline, right? The example I'm using, I know I'm gonna run out of time, but the example I'm using is because one day we went strawberry picking with my kids, and they were holding the punnet of strawberries in the back seat as we're driving home, and of course I told them, no, whatever you do, don't eat the strawberries, we need them when we get home, like the blueberry and sal moment, where we're gonna can these for the winter, right? And of course my kids don't listen to me, but they're smart enough to know that if they eat strawberries and they throw them on the floor, I'm gonna be pissed as all hell. So they open the window just noticeably enough to stick out the back ends, right? Because no one eats the green stuff. I mean, that would be diabolical, right? If they eat the green stem and go, I don't know what happened, it just disappeared, there's no remnants. So they stuck them out the window. And as I'm filling up gas, I notice that there's this red streak across the back of the car. And I'm going, oh, strawberries and gasoline, that's a nice elemental structure. Right? So it looks like, if we have to explain configural mixtures look like functional compositionality. You take two primitives, you stick them together, you have a new functional complex, right, which doesn't have concatenative structure. Sometimes, though, you do have elemental structures. And someone might wonder, wait, so what you've shown is that the olfactory system sometimes uses functional compositionality, and sometimes uses concatenated compositionality. But you haven't shown yet that it doesn't use that it has non-decomposable functional compositionality. So let's
question. But strawberry itself is a configural system, right? I mean, it's a combination of so many things that created strawberry. So
yeah.
In a sense, you really don't have an X plus Y. I just want to be sure I understand you.
No, I'm using the example.
Okay.
Right? But yeah, no, but you can do it with other ones. So if it turns out to be that you use something with a sulfur smell with lime, right? So sulfur and lime together, it's going to stick apart. And there's a whole explanations of how this happens in terms of the overall chemicals, and if they overlap in terms of their structural, and if they overlap in structure, then most likely you get configural and not elemental. It turns out to be that there's even a better explanation. Let's get to it. But yeah, I could use monomolecular structures too. But if I use examples of monomolecular structures to a non-fragrance audience, they might go, right? So, but strawberries and gasoline, we know what those smell like. That's all. But good. I'm going to keep on moving because I'm about to run out of time. And when I do, then you can bug me with whatever questions. Unless it's clarificatory. Strictly clarificatory. Good. Philosophers don't understand the difference. Okay, so the wonder might be, well, wait, it looks like that elemental mixtures is a counterexample to your argument that the olfactory system uses a combinatorial system that is not composable, or not concatenated. Well, it turns out to be that we have the concentration effect. If you take an elemental mixture and you increase the concentration of one of the components, you can shift the experience from being elemental to being configural. Right? So if I say, take gasoline and strawberries, right, which one do you think is the dominant one?
Yes.
Gasoline. Take that strawberry smell and just ratchet up the concentration level. Before you know it, you get this interesting configural. I played this in the lab. I suggest you don't use gasoline in the lab. I was thrown out of the lab for this. It's like, get out. It's like, oh, come on, guys, it's cool. They're like, you brought gasoline into the lab. So you can use the concentration effect, whereby you can shift that from being an elemental to configural. So philosophers hate counterexamples. Right? So I can get rid of the counterexample that way. But even if I don't get rid of the counterexample, it turns out to be that all elemental mixtures are processed by the amygdala. All configural mixtures are processed by the piriform cortex. So as far as our cortical encoding is concerned, anytime that we have a complex mixture, we're going to experience as configural, which is evidence for functional compositionality. But once again, this gets me functional compositionality. So if my argument was that in terms of the difference between conceptual content and non-conceptual content, to explain the difference between perception and thought, we have concatenation and non-concatenation, that's fine. But if we're associative, right, or connectionist, then we're not going to buy this argument. So I still need to show that sometimes olfaction has a different format altogether. And I can do that when we start talking about actual perception. So we call this the Lang effect. Okay? Anytime that you have the experience of a complex mixture, you can, in the end, experience or decompose it 3 to 4 of its component parts. So what Lang and Livermore originally showed is that if I take 10 to 12 different individual stimuli, and I let you smell all of those individual stimuli, and then I compose an 8-component mixture, and I ask you to tell me what components are in the mixture, you can in the end name 3 to 4 of the components at a time. If I give you access to the individual components, so I say smell it and then smell the individual components and try to decompose it, once again, you can only get 3 to 4. Now in each sequence, you can get different 3 or 4. Right? So if you ask professional chefs how they decompose each other's menus, what they do is they go and they eat the other person's menu place, they ate it, they taste it, they smell it, and they kind of go, here are 3 components, they smell it or taste it again, 3 or 4 more components, but they only get 3 or 4 at a time. Okay, so think about the classic pasta sauce. Right? It has tomatoes in it, garlic in it, what else? Well, those other 3 to 4 variations can change it generally from a puttanesca sauce to a tomato basil sauce, right? And for the most part, it smells like pasta sauce. Right? It's a complex entity, but you can't decompose individual component parts. And it turns out to be that this is true of just about all complex olfactory experiences we have. Now, what's really cool about this is that it turns out to be that we have a complex, contentful perceptual state that cannot be decomposed in terms of its component parts because it's being processed by the piriform cortex, which is an associative network that doesn't in the end encode all the component parts. It just in the end encodes the complex. And it turns out to be that this is also true of not only our perceptual states and our experiential states, but also of our cognitive olfactory states. So there's this weird thing called olfactory imagery. Even though people say you can't do it, you can imagine smells. It just happens to be it's hard. Okay? It's hard primarily because if I ask you to imagine a smell right now, can you all imagine honey? It's pretty hard. Now, the way that we trick you into doing this is we say, close your eyes, breathe in deeply, but in a large group of individuals with the authoritarian in the front of the room going, don't worry, you can trust me, close your eyes now, breathe in deeply. I mean, it's California, and I know we could do breathing exercises and meditation in class, right? But when I start telling you this, there's something weird, and you're like, no, I'm not closing my eyes in front of strangers, and I'm not breathing slowly. They're just not, right? But it works. I mean, so in a lab condition, something like 68% of the entire population can in the end generate olfactory imagery without the stimulus around. What's rather interesting about this is it turns out to be that olfactory imagery in the end mimics perceptual imagery. Not only does it turn out to be that the better you breathe, your respiration rates match the respiration rates that you have as you would perceptually and veridically perceive the stimulus. So if I was to measure the sniff rates and the overall volume of inhalations for perceiving actual honey samples versus imagining it, you're going to have more or less the same inhalation rates. Right? You're going to in the end have the same cortical firing patterns within the piriform cortex. This was a rather weird finding of Ben-Safi that turns out to be that the cortical neurons are firing in almost the same exact pattern, not exactly the same, if you in the end claim that you're actually perceiving it. And it turns out to be that when you imagine smells, it mimics the Lang effect, right? Where you in the end have a complex entity and I ask you, can you decompose it? And you can't decompose it in your head. That sounds weird, right? So it turns out to be that we have functionally compositional entities that cannot be decomposed. Well, why is this of interest? Well, it turns out to be that it explains why we can't name smells. Okay, so one of the things that people don't like about the modularity hypothesis is it doesn't buy us all that much. It seems kind of cheap. But I think it could buy us a whole bunch if we start talking about interaction effects. If we start thinking that thoughts or concepts have a certain compositional format to them, then what we might want to start looking at is when do we have incompatibilities of formats? When is there a breakdown? When is it that perception and our concepts don't interact correctly? And here's a weird thing. You can detect and discriminate over 1 trillion different kinds of smells. It's awesome. Right? You don't have that ability when it comes to colors. With colors, you have something like a few million. That's cool. It's not 1 trillion. Right? We all know that 1 trillion is bigger than 1 million, right? Despite our complex math skills. Right? But we can detect and discriminate trillions. But if I was asked you to name a smell, you're horrible about this. I mean, if it wasn't universal across the population, it would be pathologically bad. And now people think that this is not true. And you'll be surprised how many olfactory scientists who say, oh yeah, you're really bad at naming smells. Like, no, I work on smell all day, I can do this. Well, we play this game at cocktail parties, of course, with each other, name that smell, right? And of course we get disgusting things. But if you want to be nice to someone, right, you put a blindfold on them, you open up their cupboard, and you take out something like peanut butter, and you ask them to smell it. Everyone knows what peanut butter smells like? You think you do. And then I blindfold you and I put peanut butter under your nose, and you go, I don't know, could it be mustard? You're like, kind of, but no. I don't know, lavender? You're like, no. Is it honey? No. Like, what would you do with it? Like, put it on a sandwich, right? Then you take out tuna fish. Everyone knows what tuna fish smells like, right? You open it up, put them on their nose. What's this? They're like, I don't know, peanut butter? They're like, would you put it on a sandwich? They're like, sure. Would you put it on the sandwich with the same thing as last time? They're like, sure. They're like, peanut butter and tuna? Even in my undergraduate days, I don't think I tried that one, right? So we just can't name them. And the wonder's gonna be why? Well, naming requires concepts. I mean, if you think about naming tasks or identification tasks, when I ask you to identify a stimulus, what I'm asking you to do is to hold the stimulus steady in cognition, to then retrieve a concept that you have from a linguistic tag, and then to assign the linguistic tag to the item. Well, if our concepts turn out to be functionally compositional, or if they turn out to be concatenated, and olfaction has a non-decompositional system, then it turns out that we're going to have an incompatibility in formats. And unsurprisingly, that's what we find. Right? We are notoriously bad at naming things by smell. We can't, but we can detect and discriminate them. So this is a rather interesting effect, because it turns out the sensory transduction is functionally compositional, the piriform cortex is functionally compositional but non-decomposable, the anterior temporal lobe, which is the olfactory semantic centers, which we then have an output to the conceptual units. We don't know what format it is, but if this format's going to be functionally decomposable, then I imagine that this is the same format. And then when we have this, in the end, begin to project itself to conceptual linguistic centers, we should have an incompatibility in format. So one of the nice things about focusing on compositionality is not only can we see that different kinds of thoughts might need to have different kinds of compositional formats or different modes of composition, but that we can also begin to trace when we're going to have an incompatibility of format or an interface condition. Okay, so I hope what I've shown is that compositionality plays a huge role, tacitly, in a lot of different debates that we have in philosophy. It plays debate in language of thought, and between classicism and connectionism. It plays a role in the modularity of mind hypothesis. It doesn't really get off the ground if you don't have a strict idea of compositionality for thought. It plays a role in the non-conceptual content debate. The difference in concepts and non-conceptual content is a matter of composition again. And it might even explain certain cognitive abilities or perceptual abilities and why we would have an incompatibility of those. Okay. Now, of course, I have not talked about cultural mediation and how that might play a role, but I don't have time. Thank you. Okay, any questions?
So we're going to follow the tradition of allowing any students to ask questions first and then faculty second. So if any students have questions, raise your hand and I'll call on you. Go ahead, Mark.
So a little unfortunate that you jumped over the cultural mediation portion of that, because I was definitely very interested in sort of your response towards that criticism, because it seems to me that there's a lot of task demands that are unique to olfactory experiences that we don't see in other sensory experiences. So identification of smells is not something that comes up frequently, but I do see people take as a sufficient answer for a lot of these things that it smells kind of almondy, kind of cinnamony, kind of it seems to be able to decompose it when pressed. So I was wondering if that's
Okay,
why
good.
do you feel like it's not?
So, yeah. So let's, one thought that some people have and some criticisms might be, maybe the reason that we're bad at this is because we don't practice it. If we practice smelling stuff all the time, then we'd have no issue whatsoever. And I'd be very sympathetic to that claim. I mean, olfaction turns out to be this wonderfully plastic system that can learn all the time. At one stage, someone said, well, it turns out to be that you can't, in the end, detect intranaural onset, where you can't detect which of the nostrils a stimulus is presented to. For the most part, you can't. However, you can train people. Over 3 lab sessions, if I come in and I present it to left or right, and then I give you some biofeedback, before you know it, you can do it. And you can begin to have intranaural onset of perception. So I'd be very sensitive to that, except that the people that you would imagine who'd be really good at this stuff, perfume chemists, and people that work in the perfume industry, and coffee experts, turns out to be that all of their wonderful conceptual apparatuses for smells don't help. So the one person I would really expect in the end to be able to decompose something, right, or be able to be given a stimulus and say what are the component parts, would be something like a sommelier. Right? So if I was in Davis and I said this out loud, I might get run out of the room. But sommeliers can't do this, right? If I take a glass of wine and I stick it under their nose and say, what are the notes, right? They're a chance. They could get 3 to 4, which is still impressive, right? But if you're thinking about something like a 13-year-old, I don't know, Bordeaux, right, that has been carefully aged, I expect a whole lot more, right? Now, if it gets worse though, if we get the sommelier and we put a white wine versus a red wine under the nose and ask them which, they're at chance. They should know better, right? I mean, you expect that if they have 5 years of training, that they should be better. Coffee experts turn out to be at chance as well for identification tasks. It's different than when you start talking about sorting tasks. Okay, so if I get a sommelier and I say, okay, there's 13 bottles of wine here from 3 different regions of France, sort them. They can do it perfectly. However, if I get someone who likes to drink wine, but is not a sommelier, they're almost as good. Right? So if I get a wino as opposed to a sommelier, it turns out that they sort things more or less into the same categories that the sommelier would do. Right? So it's not something about the overall conceptual apparatus that the person has at play, it's something about the experiences. One of the rather interesting things about olfaction is that the more experiences that you have, the better you are at detection and discrimination. But naming doesn't increase. The only population where naming turns out to be better than at chance is one little small indigenous group in the Philippines. Okay, now it turns out to be that they're the only ones where that their naming ability for smells is at the same rate as their naming ability for colors. So there's no deficit. And what we usually do is we compare naming abilities for vision versus naming abilities for olfaction. In the West, we're horrible. And quite often people will say, oh, it's because we don't like smells, because we're bad at smells, we don't experience smells. It turns out to be that next to this one little tiny indigenous tribe, there's another indigenous tribe who turn out to have more or less the same lifestyle, same linguistic use, same lexical concepts for smells, and they have the same deficit as us. So it's unclear what's going on. What seems to be going on is this one group is hunter-gatherers. They talk about smells every single day as part of their daily lives. And it's unclear why they don't show the deficit. The thing is that when we start comparing deficits between visual modalities and olfactory modalities, their visual naming abilities are well below ours. So yeah, there's no deficit between the two, but if we ask them to name colors, they suck compared to Native Americans and English speakers. So the wonder is why, and what's going on there. My hand-wavy gesture to this is, look, language is actually something that we conceive of as a tool. If we conceive it as a tool, we're going to see neuroplasticity. If we see neuroplasticity, what's going to be interesting to see is, do they have the same kind of configural, non-configural effects as we have? Now, no one's actually tested out whether or not they have the Lang effect or not. I would be very fascinated to see whether or not this small little indigenous tribe has a Lang effect. If they don't, then I would want to, of course, plug them into a scanner and see, right, what's going on in the piriform cortex. But as you can imagine, we're not there yet. And, of course, a philosopher's wish list of experiments will never happen.
I just have 2 quick questions. One is sort of along that line. It seems like a simple experiment for the practice thing would be to, like, could you give someone the same stimulus over and over and have them memorize that stimulus and then see if they can recognize that, right? So we don't practice naming the things like you're talking about like that, but if I just brought you into a lab and was like, okay, this is Coke. Smell it? Okay, smell it again, this is Coke. And then bring you in later, can you identify this? Has that been done, or?
Yeah, so we've done that. So you take the same set of samples, and you just, in the end, allow the person to try to identify them over and over again. Yeah, it doesn't really increase. There's a marginal increase. So when we start saying that there's a deficit in olfactory identification, what we basically mean is that you can identify something like 50%. It varies between 26 to 68%, depending upon the study being done. Few studies have looked at, in the end, requiring a full-blown recognition task whereby I generate the tag and say the tag. But the ones that have shown an increase, I think, of somewhere between 3 and 18%, which isn't that huge. If you think about vision, right? I mean, so if we use vision as our target phenomena, which is why it's important to think about target phenomena as something that's a theoretical tool, then in vision that would be really odd. Right? If in the end I had a visual cue and I brought you in and I said, name this, right? And then over 3 trials you only increase by 3 to 18%, we would be shocked, right? After 2 trials we'd want you to be at ceiling most of the time. I mean, if you think about the odd visual object concepts, so not like the Booba Kiki, but the weird artifact concepts. Within 3 sessions, people are at ceiling at naming the different genders of these little weird wax sculptures. We don't get that in olfaction, right? And so the question is going to be why? So one way would be go, well, it's just weird, right? It's just different systems. But what would be interesting is to see what's the overall structure there, right? I mean, so that's why I think composition is a cool thing, because there's not one kind of composition. It's the mode of composition depending upon the system that's using it. And then whenever we have an interface issue, we might want to think about what's the kind of structure that would explain that we have an interface issue. Yeah?
So I'm convinced that I'm one of these people that cannot imagine a scent if you ask me to. But when I try to, what I actually do is sort of try to simulate a visual context and like piggyback on those other senses to get there. And there's also, I find a tendency to recognize smells easier if I try to imagine the context that would be in. So what do you think is how this plays into how this philosophy?
So I mean, this is something I'm beginning to worry about now. Cross-modal effects. And so if in the end we have this odd format in smell that doesn't seem to be the same format in vision, and probably isn't the same in audition, but I'm not an auditory expert. Right? I mean, we're all visual experts because that's what we're trained in as we come up through undergraduate, right? And then as we become graduate students, we go, wait, vision is so busy and it's so hard, let's do something else, so I do smell. So the wonder is going to be what happens there. I mean, so think about the image that we had for the olfactory imagery. Get this big, huge image of a honeycomb, right? And I prime you with the visual image, right? And then it's warm, right? So the warm color also in the end increases your ability to imagine it. Then how does that affect the olfactory ability? It's unclear. I'm not sure. And that's something that hopefully we're going to be working on this spring. I'm going to be in Antwerp with Ben Snene working on mental imagery. He's bringing me on to worry about olfactory imagery because he wants to worry about visual imagery. And I said, olfactory imagery doesn't work the way visual imagery does. And he's like, show me. He's like, cool, invite me out for it. So we're going to be worrying about these kinds of things. I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's going to be a breakdown. But notice when olfactory imagery does work, what quite often happens is that you have to have all these associations. Right? So usually what we do is we have someone in a lab and we relax them first, right? And then of course we use our soothing tone. Breathe deeply. Imagine a warm summer's day. Imagine the hay on the fields as it's been freshly mown. You know, and we slowly lull you into the sense, right? And of course, what begins to happen is you claim that you imagine these. Now, one huge problem that we might wonder is, are you confabulating or not? Right? How do we tell? I mean, that's one thing that the whole secondary measures of smell is supposed to show us. If the inhalation is the same, if the respiratory rates are the same, if the cortical firing is the same, and you say you're having the experience, it's a pretty good inferential basis to say you're having the same experience. But once again, how do we tell? So that would be the experimental issue we're not sure about. But you get back to I don't know how the association of the visual imagery and the conceptual imagery affects or doesn't affect the olfactory imagery. And part of that is, as I said in the beginning, it's a small field. There's only 3 labs that work on olfactory imagery, to the best of my knowledge, and they're all from the same lineage, right? So it's one person's lab and then 2 people's postdocs, and that's how it's working right now. Right. Yeah.
I don't really follow the logic of why a lack of decompositionality would explain the inability to name something. Because even if you had a complex for peanut butter, why couldn't it have just one link, you know, to the language cortex to name that complex? Do you have to break it down?
Okay, so I didn't go through this, right? So the composition in language and cortical composition, it turns out to be that what begins to happen is you have this wonderful hierarchical structure of associations in visual object recognition or language recognition in general, right? That is transferred throughout the temporal lobe. So going back to this slide, the reason why it's interesting that the piriform cortex and olfaction, which is primarily responsible for object recognition, you can call that, and in fact projects to the anterior temporal lobe, is we think the anterior temporal lobe is responsible for something about compositional structure in language. The wonder is going to be what? Well, it turns out to be that the ATL is responsible for syntactic encoding, but not semantic encoding. And what's interesting about that is you're going to need syntax and semantics working together. Right? It's not just going to be the elements, it's going to be how the elements are put together. Now, in language, it turns out to be that we get all these wonderful associations. Right? So when I start talking about fish, you're associating that with pets. Right? At one stage, I told my child, you can have any pet that you want so long as you take care of it. And he said, I want a whale. And I thought, yeah, that's not the right association. Like, how did you get there, right? Now, it turns out to be that someone had a whale in one of the books that we're reading, which is how he got that association. But those associations are built into your concepts, into your language concepts, right? Priming effects. Right? Think about classic priming effects in social psychology or in cognitive psychology. The whole notion of a priming effect is that the word, semantic value of the word, begins to associate with other associated semantics that you have. Right? The further away the semantic associations, the longer the priming works or doesn't work. Right? And then when you have cross-modal priming, right, once again you have this association of compositionality. Right? So if I had to take a gamble, I don't think the classical model is going to work because it doesn't explain priming effects or secondary processing effects. But if your concepts have this functional compositionality, which you can decompose them, then notice that whenever I say something, right, or I prime you for a given concept, you have access to all this other information. In olfaction, you don't have that access. Now, it turns out that you have lots of interesting access, right? So if you can't name the smell, you can still say, is it edible or not edible? You can still say, is it pleasant or not pleasant? So you have some access to it, but not full. So there's one rather interesting study where someone said, well, maybe olfaction is kind of like facial recognition. So we know facial recognition is not concatenative. It's functionally compositional. And so there's a certain problem with naming when it comes to faces. If I can't name a face, do I still have associative information with it? Turns out we do. Right? So if in the end you can't name the person, right, but you can in the end see the face in your head, you can start talking about the context that you saw them in. Think about how you do this after a party. Oh, did you meet so-and-so? I don't know who so-and-so is. I'm really bad with names. So people then describe them, oh, they're brunette and about this tall, and I go, yeah, that doesn't help so much. Right? And then I say, oh, they work on such and such, and I'm like, oh, I know who that is. Right? Not by name, but I know who the person is. Right? So I have all these associations despite the fact that I can't name the face. In olfaction, if I can't name the smell, I don't have any semantic associations with it. It's this weird thing. I might have use or functional-based associations, but that might be because those are encoded not by the piriform cortex, those are in the end encoded by the hippocampus and amygdala, which we have another direct connection to. So it goes from sensory transduction to the amygdala and another pathway to the piriform cortex, which might explain what's going on. So you're right, it doesn't fully establish the argument until we start going through all the neuroscience.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Does that have anything to do with the fact that you can't name stuff? Does that have anything to do with the fact that there's possibly trillions of options versus like a million something? And there's just too many to have experienced, useful. And so like if you're living in a community and you live in the jungle or whatever, you get a sense for all of the smells that are around you in your environment, but you could never name any of the other ones.
Yeah, but the only problem is that we have a similar deficit with familiar odors. Okay, so if we use an unfamiliar set versus a familiar set for a naming task, the difference is going to be between, let's see, so you've got 26 to 38% of the literature for a novel stimulus that you've never smelled before. You have a 50% success rate when it's a familiar odor. Okay, so that still strikes me as odd, right? I mean, with visual object identification, you're at 80%. Right? And then most of the time you're at ceiling. It's going to be really hard if you use geometrical figures with individuals for objects and vision. There you're going to be at ceiling all the time. If you use tables and chairs and other artifact concepts, it'll be at 80% for naming.
But how many, I mean, there are infinite number of geometric objects that we don't have names for, so like, are those counted in that?
I don't think people use those, right? I mean, if we use the ones that we classically train you on, but if we use the smells that you're classically familiar with, peanut butter, ketchup, mustard, lemon, lime, right, cantaloupe, right, things that you come across on a daily basis, then you still have difficulty. I mean, my favorite thing is at one stage, I played this game with my son who eats peanut butter sandwiches every single day. I mean, he eats Elvis sandwiches. I mean, like a Jewish version of an Elvis sandwich. Everyone knows an Elvis sandwich is? This is the most important. Huh?
Peanut butter and mashed banana.
Peanut butter and mashed banana, bacon. Right? We cut the bacon part in our house. So we have peanut butter.
I'm vegetarian, so
We have peanut butter, mashed banana, and chocolate spread. So part of Nutella, depending on what's on hand. So he eats the same sandwich every single day for like 2 years straight. It was a source of annoyance with, like, I have to make the same. It's a complex sandwich too. Right? And I was like, one day I was like, let's just do olfactory identification with my child, because developmental psychologists play with their kids most of the time. And I was like, here, what's this? He's like, I don't know. I was like, okay, let's play this again, right? So I warmed up the peanut butter in the microwave to make sure that it's perfectly volatile, right? Made sure to get something soft and silky so he didn't feel like I was grabbing his head, and go, okay, let's try this again. What's this? And he's like, I don't know. I got mustard out. I was like, what's this? Warmed up in the microwave, don't know. So even if we use familiar odors, right, ones that we use on a daily basis, we're bad at this. Even if we use coffee experts, okay, so someone who their job depends upon olfactory identification, or at least they claim it is, so they have the full conceptual resources, they spend their entire day sniffing coffee, and then I ask them to identify like the region or the variety of coffee, and I put it in front of their nose, 50%. Right? So that's a familiar odor over and over again. They've been trained on it, and they're still bad at it. So I don't know what the explanation would be. So I understand that we'd want to say it's something about training and familiarity, but it's just not true, right? Even if we start talking about something like this other tribe in the Philippines who turns out to have an odor lexicon, so they talk about smells on a daily basis. They actually have adjectives and adverbs for smells, which we don't have in English. So they have this whole robust conceptual apparatus for smells. They're just as bad as us. And there's only one small, little, tiny hunter-gatherer group in the entire world that doesn't show this deficit. Weird. Yeah. So I don't think familiarity is going to explain it. I mean, I do agree that we are visual objects, right? I mean, so we're visual animals. A better explanation might be the visual system itself is concatenative. And so we have five, in the end, we have five connections before we get to the language centers in olfaction. I don't know how many we have in vision. I mean, because if you think about vision, we have 3 links already to LGN, right? From that point onwards, then it diverges outwards, right? So that vision is processed in parietal cortex, and temporal cortex, and occipital cortex, and then there's all, of course, that down feedback from the to the prefrontal cortex. So in vision, you get all of this robust hierarchical structure in the representation of a visual object, which might explain the concatenation we have. So it might come hand in hand. Does that help?
Yeah, it just made me think that is it that the smells are complicated enough that you can't break them down to the molecules? Those are not molecules, but to some level that is appropriate. And
Yeah.
as to having a geometric shape that has so many things on it, that you can't get a sense for it, and you can't differentiate it from something that's slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, it could go that way. So one claim you could run with is that the target phenomenon you're talking about is chemistry already. And if the target phenomenon turns out to be a non-concatenative target, then everything from that point onwards is going to be non-concatenative too. The only problem you run into is our detection discrimination is so good. It's astoundingly good. Where I can present you with a novel odorant one day, and 15 days later present you with another novel odorant and ask you if they're same or different, and you can tell me. So it's kind of weird.
If there are any faculty that have questions, I just want you to know that you can ask questions now. Should have a time that I do that, but anyhow.
I've been waiting so patiently.
One argument that I've heard against Fodorian modularity is this idea that what Fodor was characterizing as cognitive processes not talking to each other was actually the process just taking a long time to get through one another. So, like in your example with the target, this argument would say that, if I were to stare at the target and just conceive of all the different things that it could be, eventually I would come to the idea that it could be a layer cake. At least I think that's what they're saying. What do you make of that?
So I don't necessarily love Fodorian modularity. I probably don't think it's true. I mean, one of my supervisors might kind of have a conniption at that, but because his entire thing is modularity. But it gives us a nice basis for trying to worry about when can executive functions or cognitive functions interact with perceptual functions. Right? And now, if we don't, his major arguments for modularity are really bad. I mean, so one argument we have for modularity is cognitive penetration or lack thereof. Right? And horribly named to start with. Right? And if we start thinking about influences, it's a better way of thinking, right? When can perception influence concepts? Or when can concepts influence perception? Right? So if I started out the talk by talking about cakes, right? And sort of primed you with jelly beans that were cake-like, I mean, I can't afford Jelly Bellies, but if I could on my research budget, right, I feed you all cake Jelly Bellies, right? And then you have cake pie. And then I show you a target, and I'm like, hey, anyone think of something else that could be? Maybe someone goes, oh, it's a cake. It just looks like a target. Maybe. So I think what's more interesting about modularity is not the claim that things have to be fully encapsulated, is that different processes within perception and cognition might have different formats. And if they have different formats, then there's going to be interface issues. I mean, one of the classic things that no one in the end talks about is if Fodorian language of thought is right, and if the modularity claim is right, then how do the perceptual modules ever talk to the executive modules? I mean, if Fodor's really right about this, then the perceptual modules have their own format, and the executive unit has its own format. So if one's speaking English and the other one's speaking Spanish, how do they talk to each other? There'd have to be another module of a translation module. So it can't be as strict as he thinks it is. But if we start thinking about something more like composition, where it turns out to be we have elements and we have primitives and we have composition and decomposition functions, then we're going to imagine that sometimes one system can use the elements from other systems, and sometimes it can't. And sometimes we'll have compositions that work, and sometimes we'll have compositions that don't work. Notice that when we're talking about retronasal and orthonasal smell, right, when I asked you to open up your nostrils, and then all of a sudden you got the taste of it, right, the flavor of it, that works for the most part, where you had olfactory association, we call it, right, where the olfactory association is you're associating the olfactory stimulus with something in your mouth. But sometimes it doesn't work, or sometimes I can present you with something in your mouth, and you don't associate it with a flavor, you associate it with a smell. And sometimes it goes the other way. So anytime that I serve you something that has a strawberry smell, strawberries you think of as being sweet. And so we can use strawberry odorants as a booster effect. So this is something that's kind of odd. They didn't realize that when they added cherry flavorant to Dr. Pepper, that people would automatically assume that it tasted sweeter. So this is something that sensory scientists have to do all the time. My wife works for SodaStream, who's now owned by Pepsi. And the last time I went in, I talked to a sensory scientist about olfaction, and they were telling me all sorts of stuff that went wrong, especially in these kinds of cases. So in the initial batch of cherry Coke or whatever it was completely wrong, because since it had some sort of cherry-like odorant to it, people thought it tasted too sweet. So they actually had to take down the sugar level, which is kind of odd for a Coke company or a Pepsi company, where they ratchet up the sugar. So the associations sometimes work and sometimes don't. So going back to modularity, I don't think that as a strict thing it's going to work. A better way of thinking about it is how do the interface systems work or not work, right? Especially if we're going to start thinking about cross-modal associations or cognition affecting perception. Follow-up or new question?
Follow-up to Jordan's question. So Jordan was talking about how there's a difference in the complexity if you're distinguishing between trillions and millions, right? And I think he's also right that there's a difference in complexity among sort of the amount of axes you have, and if you're distinguishing between chemicals and decomposers or something like that, right? And so it seems to me that it actually almost makes sense that even if they're otherwise the same except the amount of complexity, if you were trying to build a classifier for a thing of a trillion of things and also the Borel estimated dimensions, it's going to end up with looser categories, right? And so my question, I guess, is that when people are trying to distinguish the smells, do they suck at naming the exact thing, or can they get within the approximate category?
So when we start thinking about approximations, right? So if I start asking for associated contents, right? So edible, non-edible, daily use, non-daily use, cleaning, non-cleaning.
Or like bitter or something like that, maybe.
So bitter is going to be a gustatory effect, but that's a good example of sensory substitution, right? Where it turns out to be that we associate. Sweet, same. So if we start thinking about valence categories, whether or not we enjoy it or don't enjoy it for olfaction, then we're a lot better at that, right? Is it a good smell or is it a bad smell? So then we're very good at that. If I ask you for functional use, right, what would we use this for? We're a little bit better. If I ask you for sorting categories, right, so depending upon which those are going to be, depends upon cultural norms, right? So what we consider to be cleaning products would usually have citrus odors to them, or some sort of mint-like odorants. In Asia, it's going to be more melony smells. So lots of things that we think will be edible, they think of as cleaning products. And so there are these weird cultural norms for associations depending on daily use. One great example is peppermint. In America, we associate peppermint smells with like cleanliness and virtue and Christmas. In England, they associate it with cleaning fluids in hospitals and death. Right. So what we associate with Santa Claus and happiness, they associate with death and destruction. And so you have these weird associations depending on cultural norms. So it's unclear. We'll get better at it, right? But if you think about visual object recognition, right? Visual object recognition and naming identification is really good, right? Not just colors, right? So I think colors are a bad example. We always use colors as our examples in vision, right? But if we think about objects, right, three-dimensional things with lines and edges, because that's what the visual system is better at, then there's a tremendous number of those too, right? Now, it turns out that I can train you up on them. I mean, so this is one of the nice things about artifact concepts in vision, right? Those weird three-dimensional entities with things falling out that look like wax objects. Over 3 or 4 trials, we can be at sealing it, naming these things, right? If I say, here's Bob, and Bob has some weird appendages, and you've never seen Bob before. And then over 3 trials, you can always name that it's a Bob or a Nancy. In olfaction, we're not quite as good at that. I mean, so maybe there's certain things when it comes to other modalities. I've been worrying about this in terms of audition every now and then, whether or not there's certain sounds that would be more associated with certain things than others. Notice that we have similar effects when it comes to sound recognition. So if I ask you to name a note, you're going to be really bad at this, but that's not the elements, right? So a lot of this will depend upon one of the primitives. If I ask you to name a song, people get a little bit better at it. Still not so great, but notice that if I ask you to name which band did it, then quite often you can name the band. So maybe there's deficits in other places. We know that there's deficits when it comes to tactile stimulation in terms of the overall somatosensory cortex, right, and what the association would be, right? So we can't tell the difference if I'm poking you here or here for the most part, which seems a little bit odd because they're very close to another, right? Whereas on the lips we have better composition. So I think the format of composition is going to be something interesting throughout different modalities. That help? Yeah.
In computer science, there's this saying that you can't talk about data structures without talking about algorithms. Data structure is just a bunch of bits until you talk about how you operate on them, and vice versa. Could it be, you've been focusing a lot on the nature of representations.
Yeah.
Could it be that it isn't so much about how that content is represented, but what processes are available in order to process that content? So there are plenty of computational examples of taking highly distributed, what described as functional representations, and pulling the components back out again. So if you add that downstream, it looks very almost concatenated in nature. If you don't, it's not there, then maybe it doesn't look that way. If there's a stream that's highly plastic and has access to the right context inputs from other parts of the brain, then maybe it can be learned where it wasn't there before. But if you don't have that, and there isn't the right kind of plasticity, then maybe it can't be easily learned.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an idea. I don't know. I mean, the nice thing about the plasticity of the olfactory system is theoretically you could train someone on this. So theoretically you could bring someone in, give them the same monomolecular component over and over again until they can identify which monomolecular component it is, right? And then introduce them to a second one, begin to see if it's binary or combinatorial. It's unclear. I mean, so when I've spoken to people who do this as a profession, so Noam Sobel's lab at the Weizmann Institute, they're the ones who published this great paper on olfactory white. If we put together enough components, will we eventually get something that is the equivalent of a white phenomena, something that's just neutral, regardless of the 30 component mixture? When I was speaking to them, what they were saying is that every single time you brought a person into the lab, they always first identify it as an elemental thing. So it wasn't that they had this white mixture of 30 different components and they smelled it and went, it's bland, it's vanilla. And then the next time they brought it in, it's bland, it's just white again. It turned out to be that they had to sniff it a few times. And so the configural effect didn't come in a little bit later. Everything was elemental first, where they're sniffing it, there's different parts to it, and there's a complex structure. And then the system summed it as being this complex configural thing. So they claimed it was like a learned effect. And the only way that you got these whites is if you controlled for molecular structure differences and concentration variance. So it's unclear what's going on there. So it's unclear whether or not the system actually turns it into a learned effect. The piriform cortex is the associative learning area of the brain for olfaction. The amygdala, where you get the elemental mixtures, seems to be a straightforward, not associative. I'm not sure. I mean, so it might depend on the processes available. It's something we could certainly test for. I think the best hypothesis we have right now is it turns out to be that from all the data we have, one system is using one process, and our conceptual systems are using another process, and that's why we have an interface issue. I think it'd be really interesting to do something on that one indigenous culture and see, right, how are they processing smells, right? Is it a concatenated format? And that'd be simple, right? You do the Lang effect again. And if they go, oh my gosh, you know, here are the 8 components. Why do you guys think this is so hard? Then we go, wow. And then we could do imaging on the piriform cortex and see, is it associative or is it elemental? That would be interesting. And then it would give us a whole interesting insight into the effect of language use on plasticity and brain association representation. So I think that's right. I just like to focus on representation because I'm an armchair person.
Thank you so much.